allowing animals to follow plants out of permanent water. As they spread across the land, the plants pumped out oxygen from their leaves. So from the very beginning, land animals were dependent upon plants, not only for food, but for the very air they breathe. A major difficulty for plants in their new environment was reproduction. If they were to produce fertile seeds, pollen from one had to reach and fertilize the ova, the eggs of another. Conifers, pines, yews and firs then, as now, used wind. They produced vast numbers of pollen grains, scarcely bigger than particles of dust, which the wind could carry for hundreds of miles. The technique was successful, but very wasteful. Immense quantities of pollen grains had to be produced if just one was to reach its target. But then, about 140 million years ago, some developed a much more efficient way of doing that. With flowers. How this happened was, for a long time, a total mystery to scientists, including one of the greatest. Charles Darwin was baffled by what he called an abominable mystery. The fact that halfway through the age of the dinosaurs, flowering plants suddenly produced a vast number of species, and within a very short period of time. That contradicted one of the characteristics of evolution as Darwin saw it, that it was a slow and gradual process. How could that have happened? From the moment Darwin posed the question, scientists have been striving for an answer. Recent fossil discoveries and modern DNA analysis of species present and past have transformed our understanding of this fascinating period. Using that information, scientists with work pioneered here in Kew have been able to construct the ancestral tree of the whole of plant life. It begins with algae, the simplest of the plants, which are followed by the mosses. The thickness of the rising branches indicates the relative number of species in each individual group. For the first half of the plant's evolutionary history, all the branches of plant life flourished roughly equally. But then, 140 million years ago, there was an explosive radiation of species, Darwin's mystery. These were the angiosperms, flowering plants. Their evolution was more gradual than Darwin had thought, but there is no question that the angiosperms quickly became the dominant group. They diversified into a huge range of species, which have occupied almost every known habitat on Earth. But what happened to stimulate this dramatic radiation? There was a happy coincidence of two events. The first was a doubling in the genetic material of plants, allowing them to evolve more quickly when their environment changed. The second was one such change: the development of a unique relationship between plants and animals. The effect of this coincidence can be seen in one of the very first flowering plants to evolve. This is the water lily house, the hottest and most humid environment in Kew. It was built in 1852 to accommodate the latest botanical discovery, the giant Amazon water lily. Now it's February and the pond is almost bare, but in a few weeks exotic water lilies of all kinds will be sprouting. The ancestors of today's water lilies, as we know from their fossils, were among the first plants to produce flowers. Bright petals, modified leaves, were an advertisement to flying insects. They signalled the presence of highly nutritious pollen. The shape of the flower worked like a primitive trap, forcing the insects to stumble about and bump into the plant's reproductive structures. In doing so, the insects transferred onto the water lily pollen which they had accidentally collected on earlier visits to other flowers. So now plants could trick insects into transporting their pollen directly from one plant to another with a door-to-door service. The flower of the giant Amazon water lily can close totally, holding the insects captive for several hours, thus making absolutely sure that pollination occurs. Many different species of plant followed suit, each evolving its own particular flowers to attract its insect messengers. Competition for their services drove the plants to diversify. Insects favoured petals that were brighter, scent that was more perfumed, and flowers that had the sweetest nectar. The appearance of such temptations had a huge effect on the insects. They too began to diversify. A multitude of forms could better harness the potential of the numerous species of flower. Insects with large eyes could spot the flowers. Powerful wings could carry them between plants. And complex mouthparts could delve into the deepest nectary. So plants and insects evolved together, driving their mutual diversity. Rainforests are the culmination of this process, containing a greater variety of species than any other habitat. And here you can see that some plants didn't restrict themselves to insects. This, for example, is known as the jade vine. But why is it this extraordinarily mesmerizing blue-green color? Well, we know that it's fertilized by bats, That's why the flowers hang out in the open so the bats can get at them quite easily. And so maybe this colour stands out particularly boldly as far as bats are concerned in the moonlight. When the bat arrives, it sticks its head into the flower to get at the honey, and as it does so and presses there, out from this hook come the stamens and dab pollen on its back. So when the bat goes away, it takes the pollen to another flower. Each and every species of flowering plant has its own unique evolutionary story that's closely coupled with the animals that pollinate it. But one family of flowering plant has developed this relationship in more complex ways than any other, and in doing so has become the most numerous and diverse on the planet. There are an estimated 25,000 species of orchid. This family had a particular fascination for Charles Darwin, as he reveals in one of his letters that's kept here at Kew. He says, "I have been extremely much interested with Catasetum, that's an orchid, and indeed with many exotic orchids. Orchids have interested me as much as almost anything in my life." Charles Darwin. One species of these amazing plants can be found growing outside in the grounds of Kew. Orchids are extraordinary plants from many points of view, but one of them is that the lower lip of the flower is controlled by a special set of genes. So that means that it can evolve and change its shape and colour while the rest of its petals remain the same. The lower lip of this little orchid has evolved to look, roughly, like a bee. And people used to think that was a kind of warning, to warn cows not to eat it, on the grounds that they wouldn't want to get stung on the tongue. But now we know that's not the case. This is a mimic of a female bee that's attracting a male to mate it, and when the male mates, it will pollinate the flower. How do we know that's true? Because this little flower produces the scent which is exactly the same as that of a female bee trying to attract a mate. The unique genetic makeup of orchids has allowed them to evolve an almost unbelievable degree of complexity. And they produce their greatest variety and complexity in the wet zone. At Kew, they're cultivated inside the Princess of Wales Conservatory. In this section, conditions are perfect for them. Each orchid species has its own characteristic form and colour. They represent the pinnacle of evolutionary cooperation between animals and plants. In their most extreme form, the relationship for the plant is an exclusive one. Only one species of insect will have the right equipment to claim the plant's nectar. This relationship between a particular kind of insect and a particular kind of plant produces some extraordinary results. This, for example, is Darwin's favourite orchid, Catasetum. Unusually for orchids, some plants are male and others are female. This is a male. It produces a kind of scent that attracts just one species of small, glossy, beautifully coloured bee. The bee lands on the lip of the orchid and thrusts its head into the orchid's flower itself. And that touches a trigger and sticks onto the bee's back this extraordinary thing, which is in fact a bundle of pollen grains called pollinia. This has a little cap on it, which after a minute or so falls off and reveals there that little horseshoe-shaped bundle of pollen grains. High-speed cameras can show us the trigger mechanism. The pollinia accelerates with great force and so ensures that it sticks firmly onto the insect's back. The bee, no doubt somewhat dazed, flies away and maybe thinks it's not going to do that again, but is nonetheless attracted to another rather different looking flower, which is the female, but which produces just that sort of scent. And it sticks its head into the female flower, and this little bundle of pollen, like a key, fits into a little aperture like a lock, and it pulls off the pollen and leaves on the bee's back a little bundle. And lo and behold, pollination has been achieved. It's hard to imagine how evolution produced such a complex pollination mechanism. But there is one orchid whose life story is even more astonishing. Many flowers produce a sweet nectar to entice insects and other animals to come and pollinate them. But this orchid from Madagascar, the comet orchid, carries its nectar at the end of extremely long spurs from the back of its flower. What on earth could have a tongue long enough to reach down those huge long spurs? Charles Darwin, who studied the fertilization of orchids, decided it could only be a moth, but nobody had ever seen it, until some years after his death, he was proved right. This is Xanthopan morgani predictor, Morgan's predicted sphinx moth. With special night vision cameras, we can show why such an immensely long tongue is needed. It's 1/3 of a metre long. Exactly the same length as the spur beneath the flower. The relationship between orchids and their insect pollinators is certainly very intimate, But the connection between these passion flowers and butterflies is even more complex. This is Passiflora, the passion vine. Like orchids, its brightly coloured displays attract pollinators. One of them is a heliconid butterfly. But this relationship between an insect and a plant is no straightforward trade-off. Passion vine and butterfly have been engaged in an ongoing game of one-upmanship for many millions of years. The butterfly doesn't just want nectar. It also wants a place to lay its eggs. A place where its caterpillars will have something good to eat immediately nearby. Passion flower leaves. And its young have huge appetites. But some passion vines have fought back. They have evolved a way to protect themselves. Poison in their leaves. But sometimes even this is no defense. Some caterpillars not only tolerate the leaves' toxins, but store them in their flesh. And now, those toxins serve as a defense against the caterpillar's predators. And the story doesn't even end here. The passion vine has evolved a second line of defense.